Professor Zyx'norp adjusted his oculars, his 4 tentacles twitching nervously as he peered at the strange creature before him. The humanid Deathworlder, as they were known throughout the galaxy, stood there, grinning like a maniac. Zyx'norp couldn't help but wonder if all humans were this enthusiastic about their injuries. And this one, the human Jake was saying, pointing to a jagged scar running down his left arm, "I got when I tried to teach my cat to swim. Let me tell you, those claws are no joke." The alien professor blinked all 7 of his eyes in rapid succession, a gesture that in his species indicated extreme confusion. "I see," he said, though he most certainly did not. "And you voluntarily attempted to submerge a terrestrial predator in dihydrogen monoxide." Jake laughed, a sound that still made some of the more timid alien species in the classroom flinch. "Well, when you put it that way, it does sound kinda stupid. But hey, you should see the other guy." He paused, then added, "The other guy being my cat, who, by the way, is still plotting my demise, I'm sure." Professor Zyx'norp made a note in his datapad. Humans derive pleasure from near-death experiences with miniature apex predators, possible masochistic tendencies. The classroom was a melting pot of galactic diversity, filled with beings from across the known universe. They had all come to learn about the newest and most perplexing species to join the Galactic Federation humans. And Jake, being the only human student on campus, had quickly become the unofficial and often witting ambassador for his species. "Tell us about another one of your battle scars," prompted Professor Qwerty, a silicon-based lifeform whose body resembled a sentient keyboard. Her keys clacked excitedly as she spoke. Jake's eyes lit up, and he rolled up his pant leg to reveal a gnarly, puckered scar on his knee. "Oh man, this one's a doozy. Picture this, me, a skateboard, and a flight of stairs that, in retrospect, was way too long to be legal." The class leaned in, a mixture of horror and fascination on their varied alien faces. Well, on the faces of those who had faces anyway. So there I was, standing at the top of this staircase from hell, my buddies egging me on. "Now, I know what you're thinking. That this endeavor was ill-advised and likely to result in grievous bodily harm," interjected Professor Zyx'norp. Jake pointed finger guns at the professor. "Bingo. But here's the thing about us humans: we hear that's a terrible idea, and our brains translate it to you should definitely do that right now." A collective gasp went through the room. Professor Qwerty's spacebar dropped in shock. "Anyway, I'm zooming down these stairs, feeling like a god among men, when suddenly bam, Jake clapped his hands together for emphasis, causing a gelatinous student in the front row to vibrate in alarm. I hit a pebble. A freaking pebble. Next thing I know, I'm tumbling down the stairs like a sack of potatoes, each step introducing itself to a different part of my body." He paused for dramatic effect, basking in the rapt attention of his alien audience. "I land at the bottom, my knee looking like it went through a meat grinder. And you know what I did?" The class held their collective breath, or whatever passed for breath in their respective physiologies. I stood up, looked at my friends, and said, "Let's do that again." Chaos erupted in the classroom. Professor Zyx'norp's tentacles tied themselves into knots. Professor Qwerty's keys rattled in what could only be described as keyboard panic. The gelatinous student in the front row straight up liquefied. "Fascinating," mumbled Professor Zyx'norp, furiously scribbling notes. "The human's response to severe physical trauma is to repeat the experience. Is this some form of neural damage?" Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, prof. It's just good old-fashioned human stupidity, mixed with a dash of adrenaline addiction." Adrenaline, chirped a bird-like creature from the back of the room. "Is this some sort of performance-enhancing drug?" "Oh boy," Jake grinned, cracking his knuckles. "Let me tell you about adrenaline. It's like, imagine the best cup of coffee you've ever had, multiply that by 1,000, and then imagine that coffee is being injected directly into your eyeballs." The bird creature's feathers stood on end. "That sounds horrifying." "Exactly," Jake exclaimed. "It's terrifying and exhilarating all at once. It's what makes us do crazy things like jump out of perfectly good airplanes or try to befriend animals that could easily eat us." Professor Qwerty's screen flickered with interest. "Is this adrenaline responsible for all human battle scars?" Jake scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, not all of them. Some are just from plain old clumsiness. Like this one," he said, pointing to a small scar on his forehead. "What do you got this beauty trying to open a can of beans?" The alien students exchanged confused glances. One brave soul, a sentient fungus named Spore, raised a mycelia tendril. "Excuse me, but how does one sustain injury from a food container? Are Earth foods particularly aggressive?" Jake burst out laughing, slapping his knee. "Oh man, if you think canned beans are aggressive, wait till I tell you about pineapples. Those things literally try to digest you while you're eating them." The room erupted in panic, chittering, screeching, and in the case of the gelatinous student, vigorous bubbling. Professor Zyx'norp waved his tentacles, trying to restore order. "Please, class, remain calm. I'm sure the human is merely engaging in, what do you call it? Pulling our appendages." "Close enough," Prof. Jake grinned. "It's pulling your leg, but I like your version better. And nah, I'm not kidding about the pineapples. They're delicious, but they're also little sadists. The professor's skin cycled through a rainbow of colors before settling on a sickly green. I see. Perhaps we should move on to a less distressing topic. Human Jake, could you elaborate on the social significance of these battle scars in your culture? Jake's eyes lit up like a kid in a candy store. Oh man, where do I even begin? Okay, so in human culture, scars are like badges of honor, you know? They're proof that you've lived, that you've faced danger and came out the other side. A tentacled student in the back raised an appendage. But isn't the goal of life to avoid danger and preserve oneself? Jake pointed at the student, nodding sagely. See, that's where humans are different. We don't just want to live, we want to live, you know. Capital L-I-V-E. We want stories to tell, experiences to share, and scars. They're like physical reminders of those stories. Professor Qwerty's screen displayed a confused emoticon. So these scars serve as memory storage devices. Kind of, yeah, Jake enthused, but it's more than that. They're conversation starters, icebreakers. You show up at a party, roll up your sleeve to reveal a gnarly scar, and suddenly you're the most interesting person in the room. The gelatinous student, who had finally reconstituted itself, bubbled curiously. Parties. Are these combat simulations where humans compare battle prowess? Jake couldn't help but laugh. Man, I wish our parties were that cool. Nah, they're just social gatherings where we eat, drink, and try to impress each other with increasingly embellished stories about how we got our scars. Professor Zyx'norp's tentacles twirled in confusion. You intentionally falsified the origins of your injuries. For what purpose? Entertainment. Mostly. Jake shrugged. Look, the truth is, most of our scars come from doing stupid shit. But I tripped over my own feet and face planted into a coffee table doesn't sound nearly as cool as I wrestled a bear to save a busload of orphans. The class erupted in a cacophony of confused alien noises. Professor Qwerty's keys clacked rapidly as she tried to process this information. But isn't this deception? How do you maintain trust in your social structures if you cannot rely on the veracity of each other's statements? Jake leaned back in his chair, a mischievous glint in his eye. That's the beauty of it, Prof. It's not really lying, it's embellishing. Everyone knows you're exaggerating, but they play along because it's fun. It's like a social game. A crystalline being in the corner of the room shimmered with curiosity. A game of falsehoods. How do you determine the winner? Whoever tells the most entertaining story wins, Jake explained. It's not about who has the biggest or baddest scar, it's about who can spin the best yarn about how they got it. Professor Zyx'norp's skin cycled through shades of confusion. So the physical evidence of the scar is secondary to the narrative surrounding it. Fascinating. It seems humans place great value on storytelling abilities. Bingo. Jake snapped his fingers, causing several alien students to flinch. Sorry guys, but yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, Prof. We humans, we're storytellers at heart. We love a good narrative, especially if it makes us look cool or tough or funny. A plant-based student near the window unfurled a leaf inquisitively. But surely there must be limits to this embellishment. Are there no consequences for outright fabrication? Jake scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, yeah, there's definitely a line. If you claim you got a scar fighting off a gang of ninjas, people will probably call bullshit. Unless you're Chuck Norris. Then they just nod and say, sounds about right. The room fell silent, every alien student and professor blinking or whatever passed for blinking in their species in confusion. Oh right, you guys probably don't know Chuck Norris, Jake chuckled. Let's just say he's a human who's so tough, even his scars have scars. Professor Qwerty's screen displayed a loading icon as she processed this information. So there are hierarchies within your scar-based social structure. This Chuck Norris is at the apex. Jake couldn't help but burst out laughing. Oh man, I can see the textbooks now. The Chuck Norris theorem of human scar hierarchies, but nah. It's not that complicated. Chuck Norris is just, well, he's Chuck Norris. The confusion in the room was palpable. Professor Zyx'norp's tentacles were practically tying themselves in knots. I'm afraid I don't understand. This Chuck Norris individual, he possesses superior scarification. Not exactly, Jake grinned, thoroughly enjoying the alien's befuddlement. Chuck Norris is more of a cultural icon, a symbol of toughness and badassery. The jokes about him are so over the top that they circle back around to being funny. The gelatinous student bubbled uncertainly. So, the humor derives from the obvious falsity of the statements. Exactly, Jake exclaimed, pointing at the wobbling mass of goo. You're getting it. It's funny because it's ridiculous. Like Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups, he pushes the earth down. The room erupted in a cacophony of confused alien noises. Professor Qwerty's keys clattered in what could only be described as keyboard hysteria. But that's physically impossible, sputtered a gravity-manipulating alien from the back of the room. The mass differential alone would. Jake held up a hand, still chuckling. That's the point, my gravitationally gifted friend. It's so absurd that it's funny. Human humor often works like that. We take something to such an extreme that it loops back around to being hilarious. Professor Zyx'norp's skin had settled into a perplexed puce color. I see. Or rather, I don't see it all. Human Jake, your species continues to baffle and intrigue us. Perhaps we could return to the topic of scars. You mentioned earlier that they serve as icebreakers. Could you elaborate on this curious metaphor? Jake leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face. Ah, icebreakers. Not literal icebreakers, mind you, though I do have a scar from the time I tried to break actual ice with my face. Long story, involving tequila and a dare, but that's not important right now. The plant-based student rustled its leaves in confusion. You attempted to fracture frozen dihydrogen monoxide with your facial structure? Was this some form of primitive tool use? Jake snorted with laughter. Nah, it was just good old-fashioned human stupidity. But let's get back to icebreakers. In human social situations, an icebreaker is something that helps start a conversation, breaks the metaphorical ice of social awkwardness. Professor Qwerty's screen displayed a light bulb icon. Ah, I believe I understand. The scars serve as conversational catalysts, facilitating social interaction between unfamiliar individuals. Bingo, Jake pointed finger guns at the silicon-based professor. You've got it, teach. See, humans can be pretty awkward creatures. We want to talk to each other, but sometimes we don't know how to start. That's where scars come in handy. The crystalline being in the corner shimmered curiously. But how does visible physical damage initiate social protocols? Jake rubbed his hands together, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. Okay, picture this, you're at a party feeling awkward, not sure how to start talking to anyone. Then you notice someone with a wicked cool scar. Boom. Instant conversation starter. You can ask them how they got it. And suddenly you're chatting away like old friends. The gelatinous student bubbled thoughtfully. So the scar serves as a visual prompt for narrative exchange. Exactly, Jake beamed. And the best part is it works both ways. If you've got a cool scar, you can use it to break the ice yourself. Roll up your sleeve, point to your scar, and say something like, "Want to know how I got this?" guaranteed to get people interested. Professor Zyx'norp's tentacles twirled in fascination. Remarkable. It seems that in human culture, physical imperfections are not hidden but celebrated as social tools. This is quite contrary to many galactic species who view scars as undesirable blemishes. Jake nodded enthusiastically. Oh yeah, we humans have a weird relationship with our flaws. We've got this saying, chicks dig scars. It means that some people find scars attractive. The room erupted in a chorus of confused alien noises. The bird-like creature from earlier chirped in bewilderment. Your females are attracted to signs of physical damage. Is this some form of mate selection based on survival capability? Jake couldn't help but laugh. Well, when you put it that way, it does sound pretty weird. But yeah, some humans find scars attractive. It's not universal, mind you, but there's definitely a subset of people who think scars are sexy. Professor Qwerty's keys clattered rapidly. Fascinating. So scars serve multiple social functions as conversation initiators, storytelling prompts, and potential mate attraction signals. You've got it, Prof. Jake grinned. But wait, there's more. Scars can also be symbols of survival, badges of honor, or even fashion statements. The gravity-manipulating alien raised an appendage. Fashion statements. You adorn yourselves with injuries for aesthetic purposes. Jake scratched his head. Well, not exactly. But some people do get tattoos to cover up scars, turning them into art. And there are even some folks who get intentional scarification as a form. Jake scratched his head. Well, not exactly. But some people do get tattoos to cover up scars, turning them into art. And there are even some folks who get intentional scarification as a form of body modification. The entire classroom fell silent. Every alien species trying to process this information. Professor Zyx'norp's skin cycled through a rainbow of confused colors before settling on a bewildered beige. Intentional scarification. The professor's voice was barely above a whisper. You willingly damage your epidermis for aesthetic purposes. Jake nodded, a mischievous glint in his eye. Yup, some humans think it looks cool. It's like tattoos, but instead of ink, you're using scars to create patterns on your skin. The gelatinous student in the front row bubbled furiously, its translucent body turning a sickly green. But why? Is this not counterproductive to survival? Jake couldn't help but laugh. Oh man, if you think that's counterproductive to survival, wait till I tell you about extreme sports. Professor Qwerty's screen flashed in alarmed red. There's more intentional risk-taking behavior. Oh, you bet your silicon circuits there is, Jake grinned, leaning forward in his chair. Humans, we're not content with the everyday dangers of life. No, we have to invent new ways to put our lives at risk, all in the name of fun, of course. The bird-like creature's feathers stood on end. Fun? You derive pleasure from mortal peril. Jake pointed at the avian alien, winking. Bingo, bird brain. No offense intended, by the way, but yeah, for some humans, the closer we come to death, the more alive we feel. Professor Zyx'norp's tentacles were practically tying themselves in knots. This defies all logical evolutionary processes. Surely a species that actively seeks danger should have perished long ago. Jake leaned back in his chair, a smug smile on his face. And yet here we are. Not only have we survived, but we've made it to the stars. How's that for defying evolution, Prof? The classroom erupted into a cacophony of confused alien noises. Chirps, bubbles, rustles, and various untranslatable sounds filled the air as the extraterrestrial students tried to wrap their diverse mindsets around this baffling human concept. Professor Qwerty's keys clattered frantically. Human Jake, could you perhaps provide an example of these extreme sports? For educational purposes, of course. Jake's eyes lit up like a kid in a candy store. Oh man, where do I even begin? Okay, how about this? Imagine hurling yourself out of a perfectly good aircraft, plummeting towards the ground at terminal velocity, with nothing but a piece of fabric to slow your fall. The gravity-manipulating alien in the back let out a high-pitched squeal. But that's madness. The potential for catastrophic impact is. Exactly the point Jake interrupted, his grin widening. We call it skydiving. And let me tell you, there's nothing quite like that rush of freefall. The plant-based student near the window wilted visibly. You do this for enjoyment, not out of necessity. Jake nodded enthusiastically. Yup, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've got bungee jumping, where you tie an elastic cord to your ankles and jump off bridges, or base jumping, which is like skydiving, but you jump off buildings or cliffs instead of planes. Professor Zyx'norp's skin had turned a pale, sickly green. I think I need to sit down, Jake continued, oblivious to the growing distress in the room. Oh, and don't even get me started on wingsuits. Imagine flying through the air like a sugar glider, but you're a human in a special suit, zipping between mountains at insane speeds. The gelatinous student had completely liquefied at this point, pooling sadly on the floor. Human Jake, Professor Qwerty's voice crackled with concern. Are you suggesting that humans regularly engage in activities that have a high probability of resulting in death or severe injury? Jake scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, when you put it that way, it does sound kind of crazy. But hey, that's just how we roll. Life's no fun without a little risk, right? The crystalline being in the corner vibrated in what could only be described as existential dread. But why? What possible benefit could outweigh such monumental risk? Jake's eyes gleamed with excitement. The thrill, my crystalline friend. The pure, unadulterated rush of adrenaline coursing through your veins. It's like, imagine the most excited you've ever been, multiply that by 1,000, and then imagine that feeling is trying to burst out of every pore in your body. The alien students exchanged worried glances. One brave soul, a multi-eyed creature from a low-gravity world, raised a tentacle. Is this sensation pleasurable for humans? Pleasurable, Jake laughed. It's freaking addictive. Once you've experienced that kind of rush, normal life just seems boring in comparison. Professor Zyx'norp, who had managed to compose himself somewhat, cleared his throat, or whatever passed for a throat in his species. Human Jake, are you suggesting that your entire species is addicted to danger? Jake pondered this for a moment. Well, not the entire species, but a good chunk of us, yeah. We've got this saying, life begins at the edge of your comfort zone. For many humans, that edge is pretty damn close to the edge of death. The room fell into a stunned silence. Even Professor Qwerty's usually chattery keys were quiet. Jake looked around the room, suddenly realizing the impact of his words. Did I break them?" he asked, glancing at Professor Zyx'norp. The alien professor's tentacles waved weakly. I believe you may have overloaded their cognitive processes, Human Jake. Perhaps we should move on to a less intense topic. Jake shrugged, a mischievous glint still in his eye. Sure thing, Prof. How about we talk about human mating rituals instead? Now that's a wild ride. The gelatinous student, who had just begun to reform, immediately melted back into a puddle. Professor Zyx'norp's skin cycled through several alarmed colors before settling on a resigned gray. Perhaps we should end the class for today. I believe we all need time to process this information. As the alien students filed out of the classroom, each looking more shell-shocked than the last, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Sure, humans might be the new kids on the galactic block, but they were certainly making an impression. He glanced at Professor Zyx'norp, who was still trying to coax the gelatinous student back into a solid form. Same time next week, Prof. I've got some great stories about human cuisine I think the class would love. The professor's tentacles drooped in defeat. May the cosmic forces have mercy on us all, he muttered. As Jake sauntered out of the classroom, hands in his pockets and a spring in his step, he couldn't help but chuckle. Being the sole human in an alien university was turning out to be way more fun than he'd anticipated. He made a mental note to wear his "I Survived Earth" t-shirt to the next class. After all, if you're going to be the ambassador for humanity, you might as well lean into the whole Deathworlder thing. Little did Jake know, his casual revelations about human nature had set off a chain reaction throughout the galactic academic community. In the days that followed, urgent messages would be sent, emergency conferences would be called, and more than a few alien species would seriously reconsider their galactic exchange student programs. But for now, Jake was content. He had a whole week to come up with even more outrageous but true stories about humanity to shock his alien classmates with. Maybe he'd tell them about competitive eating next time, or parkour. Or maybe he'd just bring in some hot sauce and watch the fireworks. One thing was for sure, life as the token human on an alien campus was never going to be boring. And if there's one thing humans like Jake live for, it's not being bored. As he walked down the hallway, he overheard a group of alien students whispering frantically among themselves. Did you hear what the human said? They jump out of flying machines for fun. I heard they intentionally ingest neurotoxins for pleasure. They call it alcohol. Well, I heard they sometimes cut open their own bodies and put metal or plastic inside just to change their appearance. Jake grinned to himself. If they thought that was wild, wait until they heard about reality TV shows. Yes, being human in an alien world was turning out to be quite the adventure. And Jake, like any good human, was going to enjoy every adrenaline-fueled, danger-seeking, scar-collecting moment of it. After all, someone had to show these aliens how to really live, and who better than a crazy, risk-loving, story-spinning human? As Jake rounded the corner, he caught his reflection in a shiny alien surface. His collection of scars, each with its own ridiculous story, seemed to shine with pride. He straightened his "I Survived Earth" t-shirt and marched on, ready to face whatever the galaxy had to throw at him. Because that's what humans do best: they survive, they thrive, and they turn every crazy experience into one hell of a story. And in a universe full of alien wonders and cosmic mysteries, sometimes the craziest thing of all is simply being human.